Okay, so let's start. Good morning or good evening, wherever you are. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our three guest speakers and share this webinar on behalf of the tourism group at Victoria University of Wellington. Today's topic is about capitalism and sustainable tourism. This is, of course, a timely topic for tourism scholars and policymakers. As we all know, prior to COVID-19, the tourism industry was among the largest and fastest growth activities worldwide. However, the pandemic has dramatically changed the policy context of the tourism industry. So, looking beyond the immediate challenges that the travel industry is currently facing to minimize the negative impacts of the crisis and foster safe travel, many destinations are nowadays exploring the opportunity to rebuild or to reimagine tourism and fast track the move to more sustainable tourism development. So, this sustainable vision for the future of tourism is often based on utopian ideals that are probably difficult to achieve and doomed to fail. So we have prepared a few questions to our guest speakers. So our guest speakers will be covering this topic, and the questions that we will be asking our guest speakers to answer are the following. How can the future of tourism reconcile these utopian ideas with realistic perspectives? Will the post-COVID-19 world be a return to the past where tourism growth for development is the norm? Or are we going to rebuild a new models of tourism development that is characterized by degrowth for livability, which is more focused on the concept of community quality of life and the principles of sustainable development? How can we manage the worst of unsustainable behaviors in the context of a balance between these two paradigms? So to answer these questions, we are fortunate to have three distinguished guest speakers from the UK and New Zealand. Our first speaker is Jim Butcher, who is joining us from the UK. Jim is a reader at Canterbury Christ Church University in the UK. Jim is an expert on tourism and policy, and he's a defender for the benefits of mass tourism. His topic is about where's my jetpack, a high-tech future for leisure travel. Our second guest is Chris Roberts, who is located in Wellington. Chris has been the chief executive of tourism industry Aotearoa since 2014. His career includes journalism, working at the Parliament, and several other corporate positions. Chris' presentations would be about the role of the customers in the future of tourism. And finally, our last guest speaker is Rachel Singleton, who is a PhD researcher at Ulster University in the UK. Rachel's research seeks to increase pro-environmental beach user behavior by using psychology and user-centered design. So her presentation would be about the value of the beach. So each guest speaker will have 10 minutes. A recorded version of this webinar will be available a few days later to all participants at this webinar. And people who are participating to this webinar are able to ask questions at any time. You have just to use the chat function and the question and answers. And as attendees, you are also able to upvote the questions indicating which ones are most popular. So after the three presentations, I'll be selecting some of the most popular questions for our guests. So that's all I have to say at this stage. So the floor is now for Jim to start. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Manda. Thank you. Hopefully this will address the questions one way or another. Where's my jetpack? Sounds like a daft question, but it's a question I think that we all should be legitimately asking at the moment. It's the title of a satirical book by Daniel H. Wilson. He looks at the many futuristic technologies optimistically featured in science fiction and futuristic thinking, but thus far not delivered. Read you a little excerpt from it. This is, he talks about this book called Skyport, a science fiction book written by Kurt Siodmak, published in 1959, actually before the moon landings took place. And this is a little excerpt. What is this thing that's so revolutionary and so daring, fantastic and at the same time logical? He looked steadily at Lee. His eyes brightened as if an inner light had been turned on. Lee glanced at the architect and the girl. He found response in their faces. I need your assistance in building a hotel in outer space, he said artlessly. Okay, so this was before Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, but they were talking about moon hotels. Okay, we don't have them yet, but it's worth noting that Thomas Cook did set up a register for people who wanted to be the first people on the moon in 1954, which was even before the book was written. So that does indicate a certain ambition, optimism, you might say naivety, and so on. But certainly for some people at that time, to adapt a well-known saying, even the sky was not the limit. So we don't have space hotels yet, but there are a lot of ideas that have one way or another come through from science fiction and visionary thinking about the future. But just for a minute, never mind the future, what about the past? The historical imagination is very important, I think, to think about where tourism, how it's developed in the past and judge where we came from in order to get a handle on how things may develop in the future. In fact, modern history has witnessed remarkable innovations that would have seemed futuristic just a generation or two before they actually became commonplace. You know, all of these things that developed over the last 200 years that we take for granted at one time or another were incredible, new, futuristic, unthinkable. So imagine, for example, labourers in late 18th century Britain, they would not have imagined that their children would be taking trains from industrial cities like Manchester to resorts on the coast like Morecambe. That would have been unbelievable. That would have been futuristic. That would have been beyond the limits that people felt that you could go, if you like. Think about the package holiday revolution of the 60s onwards, where the masses flew abroad by jet-propelled aircraft to places that, if they'd been abroad at all, they would have visited with a military kit bag and a gun in World War II in the pre-jet era. This would have been an extraordinary thing, and certainly it would have been extraordinary to their grandparents, for example. In the early 1900s, cars were deemed to be an incredible thing. In the 1950s and 60s, of all things in Britain, motorways were celebrated and eulogised about. When the M1 was built in the 1960s, of a weekend, most of the traffic on it was people just driving because they wanted to drive on a motorway because it was such a fantastic, new, innovative thing. And of course, we don't look at motorways in the same way today, really, probably the kind of opposite way. But there it is. People had a fascination and a pride in, of all things, the motorway. But I think those of us who are positive about the incredible legacy of mass tourism should not see ourselves only as history takers from the past, but also as history makers for the future, able to conceive of a tourism transformed once again. And I think what some of the science fiction and the apparently madcap schemes remind us of is to challenge something called presentism. Presentism normally refers to judging the past through the preoccupations of the present, when people look at history through the eyes of the present. But it can also mean doing something similar with regard to the future, trying to envisage the future, but constrained by an inability to think beyond the present levels of technology, the present culture that we live in, the present form of social organisation, and we become trapped in the present and able to break out of that thinking. So this is where the futurology and the science fiction come in. Not necessarily so we dream of jetpacks and moon hotels although why not? But really as a prompt towards future-oriented thinking. We can imagine futures free from the limits of the present, or at least prepared to push back those limits. We can imagine the use of technology as an extension of trends that are around now. This happens in science fiction a lot and usually ends up in dystopian directions, societies in which typically technology comes to control us, or through which we lose a part of our humanity, or high-tech societies in the aftermath of nuclear war, such as Blade Runner. But it can also be about imagining the use of technology free from the social arrangements and culture we have now in a very positive way. In other words, not dystopias, but utopias. And I think that utopian thinking has a lot to be said for it in a time of presentism. I think it is worth noting in passing that there is a great deal of discussion about technology in tourism, but it seems to me a great deal of it is very much about personal technology and biometrics, the Internet of Things, all of these kind of things, which are incredible innovations and are revolutionising travel already. Of course, there are critiques of that. Emily Thomas, in a recent book on the philosophy of travel, says that for all of the great things these bring us, it does mean wherever we go in the world, every one of us pretty much is looking at the same screen, looking at the same Google map, getting the same algorithm-generated advertisements hinting where we might or might not go. But let's just leave that to one side. But a great deal of talk about tech, a great deal of innovation, but I'm really talking more about transport, getting us places, infrastructure, civil engineering, investment, that kind of thing. So what has all this got to do with capitalism? Well, I think a lot of the debate today about tourism post-COVID and regardless of that is shaped by this presentism, by these kind of low horizons. Where is the expansive future? Who's talking about that? Whereby the 80-odd% of people who do not travel internationally are increasingly able to do so. What about imagining a society where the East African coast is as accessible for sun seekers as the Spanish costas? And what about a society where sub-Saharan Africans enjoy the sort of wealth and transport infrastructure, possibly featuring Elon Musk's Hyperloop and drones to transfer people from town to airport? Both of those, by the way, exist as prototypes already. How about that and them using that all en route to the Spanish costas on holiday themselves? I think it's the case that modern capitalism lacks an inspiring vision of a technologically informed future. There is a painfully slow development of new forms of transport. I think in the time it's taken Britain not to build any runways, China has built probably approaching 3 figures worth of airports. And that perhaps tells you something about the stagnation of capitalism in some of the more advanced countries. Talking of China, which may be regarded as an exception, they're building what are known as horizontal skyscrapers that resemble something out of Blade Runner, but without the dark post-apocalyptic vibe, without the replicants, but probably with a little bit of the dystopia. So that's all well and good, but it seems to me that critics of capitalism may be actually more limited still in their outlook. So we have a capitalism that's not particularly dynamic in many respects, but the critics are more limited still. Rather than demanding a tourism industry that contributes to a society that can systematically address poverty and the immobility that's associated with poverty in large parts of the world, instead, a lot of the opponents seem more intent on coming to terms with those limits. So one of the big talking points, certainly in the universities, and I think to a degree outside, is degrowth. Degrowth seeks, of course, degrowth, in other words, less growth, in fact, negative growth, and all that means. Degrowth also holds a very dim view of the legacy of growth. Mass tourism is typically criticised as having gone too fast, in too great numbers, and too far as well. So in tourism terms, this reverses the trend that I talked about earlier, the trend to increase leisure mobility and to view this as part of social progress. It's now viewed in a rather dim light with a lot of doubt and a lot of angst. So this to me seems to be a sort of radical hued acceptance of the limits, economic and cultural, of our contemporary society, and it doesn't challenge the presentism that I talked about earlier. Now, the pandemic, to get onto that, has, according to the World Health Organization, more than doubled the number of people who are at risk of starvation. But degrowth is actually advocating a slimmed down industry, staycations, and really what amounts to eco-austerity. This to me is a pretty degraded discussion of what's to be a new normal. It's one based upon caution and fear of the environmental and cultural negatives of growth, and they exist, and I don't deny that, but it's dismissive of the potential cultural and environmental benefits of that growth, and also it's accepting of the stultifying limits of our society as it's constituted today. So the critical school is something of a false critique, but it wasn't always thus. I think that capitalism's critics in the past did have a more optimistic and more expansive view of what was good and what was possible in terms of economic growth and it providing for people's wants and needs. For example, both Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes in the 20th century had a vision of a society technologically informed that freed people up to have more leisure time and better able to develop themselves as individuals. But I wanted to just kind of come to a close here by quoting something that was written by Bayard Rustin, who it's written in 1967, perhaps a slightly more optimistic period than the one we live in today in some respects. And he was a civil rights activist and a socialist. And here's what he wrote about leisure and tourism in his time. My working class constituents have their own version of the environment, which is equally valid and which calls for economic growth. They want lower housing densities and better schools and hospitals. They want washing machines and refrigerators to relieve domestic drudgery. They want cars and the freedom they give on weekends and holidays. They want package tour holidays to Mallorca, even if this means more noise of night flights and eating fish and chips on previously secluded beaches. Why should they not enjoy the sun? And they want these things not because their minds have been brainwashed and their tastes contrived by advertising, but because these things are desirable in themselves. So it seems to me if we're talking about capitalism and we're talking about a new normal and we're talking about critiques of the way things are, the success of any particular critique or alternative resides in its ability to provide the things that are, as Rustin said, desirable in themselves. And this is where I think we can do a lot better. We can go further, faster, in great numbers if we choose to do so, but it will require a little bit of imagination. So, where's my jetpack?
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Now, Chris.
Thanks, Monda. Kia ora tātou, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. I've been asked to talk about the role of the customer in the rebuild of tourism. And I think the key issue here is who actually has the power and greatest influence? Is it the operator determining what product and service they want to deliver, where and when and how? Is it the government determining the boundaries of behaviour and the types of permitted or encouraged activities, ways of doing things, and the taxation contribution that it requires? So government both as a steward, making sure that the tourism system is operating to some predetermined goals and that all the participants have the right incentives, information, and the capability to play their respective roles in that system. And the government as an actor itself in the tourism system, directly through its investments and interventions, such as the provision of infrastructure and funding a national tourism organisation to address market failure. Is it the community determining what sort of visitor activity it wants happening in its backyard and how it wants to protect its environment and its community values? And is this community represented by local government representatives Or is it a more localized, genuine community voice? Or is it the visitor? Different visitors with different motivations to travel and with different expectations of what experience they will have and the services and products that they wish to consume. Here in New Zealand, Aotearoa, in recent years, the visitor or customer has largely been excluded from the debates around what sort of tourism do we want. It's been fairly well presumed that the New Zealand tourism product is so compelling that attracting visitors is not really the key issue, even though the taxpayer does spend $112 million a year through Tourism New Zealand marketing to those international visitors. Instead, the focus has been on managing or even reducing visitor numbers, protecting the environment, hearing that community voice, addressing social license concerns, fixing infrastructure deficits, and identifying new funding models, new taxes. Here at Tourism Industry in Aotearoa, we believe we need to take a balanced scorecard approach. So our tourism sustainability commitment, launched in 2017, sometimes seems a lifetime ago now, has been widely adopted by operators large and small. The TSC has 12 business level commitments across 4 areas: the environment, the community, economic, and visitor. No one area in the framework is given more prominence than another. All need to be healthy and progressing for the whole to work at both an enterprise level and a destination level. But in the wider public conversations, the visitor is so often taken for granted or even somewhat demonized. The part of the system we obviously need, but somehow we would prefer to do without. Perhaps just send us your money and you can stay at home. However, as we gradually emerge from the devastation wrought on global tourism by the pandemic, where does the true power lie? Is it on the supply side or the demand side? New Zealand is not alone in having a public and government discussion about building back better, about reimagining tourism, about reshaping the future. Those same conversations are happening worldwide. But is the tourism recovery largely going to happen to us regardless? There will, of course, be some significant supply side issues, 2 of the most important being when and under what conditions governments open their borders, and then when and how airlines will provide services. But could not the single biggest factor by some considerable distance be the desire of people to travel again and where those desires take them? Each traveller will make a personal decision about where they go and when. It might be a business decision or a desire to connect again with friends and family or to attend an event. If it's a leisure trip, they'll consider the usual factors when deciding where to go on holiday, with an enhanced layer of safety and risk management. There is only so much any destination can do to manage this return of tourism once that destination opens its borders. Everyone can agree they want high-value visitors, even though no one can agree on a definition of what a high-value visitor actually is. But open sky agreements mean that pretty much any airline can fly to a country like New Zealand once they've secured a landing slot at the airport and met a few other requirements. They can then sell tickets on those planes to anyone they want. And as long as those ticket buyers meet New Zealand's entry requirements, they are free to come. The government, largely through its National Tourism Organisation, can try to target the marketing messaging at certain types of visitors, those considered more desirable. But this will likely only have an impact on the fringes. The customer will make their choice based on a range of factors quite unique to them, and that marketing may or may not be one of those influencing factors. So visitors will return in all shapes and sizes, and the market will respond to those visitors and provide the services and products that they desire. For all the idealistic thinking, our ambition and our genuine ambition to build a more sustainable tourism future, these positions will most likely be overwhelmed by the major drivers: demand plus affordable and convenient travel options that will deliver visitation in an organic way. The customer has the greatest influence, and I expect we will find that we have much less control over what happens as tourism rebuilds than we currently think we will. Kia ora.
Thanks, Chris. So we moved from the supply side to the demand side. And then now Rachel is going to talk to us about the role of customers as well.
Good morning and good evening, depending on where you're sitting right now. I am joining you from Belfast, where I'm halfway through my PhD research at Ulster University. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share with you my approach to ensuring in a rapidly changing landscape that we sustain the value of the beach. To move from the limitations of either that unattainable space of utopia or from the realm of unbounded and unsustainable growth, moving instead towards something that seeks an everyday reality of sustained enjoyment of our beaches by tourists. Next slide, please. My approach recognises that the continued provision of those derived values enjoyed by beach visitors plays an integral part in sustaining our beaches tourism offering. Beach tourism has been described as the largest tourism trade, but up to 97% of the economic value of beach visits could be lost through lower cleanliness standards. This reflects the finding that the quality most valued by beach users is clean sand and clean water. Add to this the research that shows that a doubling of litter on a beach would lead to a 60% decline in the length of stay by tourists, alongside the current newsworthy observations of soaring litter at our beauty spots here in Northern Ireland, and I'm quite sure elsewhere, and we're faced with a growing threat to sustainable tourism. My approach focuses on beach user littering behaviour and trying to change it. I'm going to introduce you to my two study beaches, the first of which is Ballywalter and then Torella here in Northern Ireland. And I'm going to describe the approach that I'm taking to share with you what I've learned so far and how this can be used to inform decision making that includes the capacity to adapt to new challenges. So how am I approaching this? Well, by creating a methodology that blends user-centered design and the COM-B behaviour change framework in trying to understand what it is that influences beach littering behaviour in beach users and identifying what will reduce this. With this, I'm exploring behavioural enablers, behavioural inhibitors, as well as beach-derived values that influence behaviour. And I aim to use this understanding to inform a preliminary intervention design to reduce littering. Throughout this process, I focus on the humans behind the behaviour impacting on our beaches, and I do this with deliberate, direct engagement with these beach users. My research objectives are, if you would go forward one slide, please, Monder. I think that we're a wee bit out of kilter here. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. To understand through the user engagement built into user-centered design what it is that influences beach users' littering behaviour, to define themes and patterns as they arise so that this can inform the co-design of behaviour change interventions, to identify the intervention functions and behaviour change techniques that are likely to be effective in changing littering behaviour, to design and prototype an intervention that can be applied to targeting littering behaviour with the potential to extend this to implementation at other beaches in Northern Ireland and further afield. And finally, to measure the usability of the intervention through user testing. All of this is with the overarching aim, ultimately, of ensuring that the beach's value is retained and that those derived values that are enjoyed by its users are sustained. Now, understanding how we can better sustain the immense tourism offering of our beaches begins with, I believe, better understanding what this value comprises to the users. I started by reviewing literature that outlines, that considers, and that measures this, and have concluded that 6 derived values exist. I think you're going to need to go backwards for this one, please. Thank you. That's perfect. So with Northern Ireland's tourism, it's valued in economic terms at 968 million, and there are around 600,000 trips taken annually in a very small place by domestic tourists to Northern Ireland's beaches. Economic value is undeniably one facet of our beaches and their tourism offering. That said, that's by no means the extent of the value of our beaches. There are 5 other derived values identified through my research, the first being ecosystem and life support value. And this is the dependency on nature in order to live. Then we've got aesthetic and landscape value. And with landscapes being an integral part of the natural environment, it's unsurprising that they're considered a key pillar of tourism. Then we've got well-being value, and that's in the physical, mental, and social space. This is to such an extent that linking nature with domestic tourism is considered central to exploiting the potential for public health initiatives to enhance visitor well-being. Then we've got interconnectedness value, and by that, I mean a sense of connection to something greater, a system of sorts, as opposed to a siloed existence. And finally, spiritual and sacramental value. And in short, that's that sense of transcending the everyday. I believe that understanding this helps with identifying what drives beach visits and what, if compromised, threatens our beach's sustained use. Now, I mentioned that my work is user-centred, and in this context, the users include those employed in managing and those concerned with maintaining the beach, whether through policy, practice, or legislation. And then those recreational users spending leisure time on the beach. I believe it's important to bring both professional and recreational users to the table so that I can learn from their insights, their lived experiences. I've now completed 17 professional beach user interviews and I'm in the process of analysing the data. And already I can see that these values are reflected in what are, at this point, very preliminary insights, but I do look forward to delving deeper. My work offers 3 key contributions. The theoretical is identifying and seeking to fill a gap in research regarding the multidisciplinary approach to understanding beach litter behaviour. And by that I mean tourism, environment, psychology, and design. The methodological, and that's that. With this research, I'm trying to introduce and test a novel blended methodology that integrates design and behaviour change to understand user behaviour and to inform the design of a behaviour change intervention. And practical, providing a rigorous and tested approach to providing new ways for public sector agencies and others to experiment with consumer relevant, sustainable beach user interventions. That is, it's a space that doesn't require the user to have awareness of sustainability as a prerequisite. It understands that green attitudes aren't necessarily required for pro-environmental behaviour. And final slide, please, Monder. I started my research in September 2019. And 6 months later, Northern Ireland, like much of the world, was in lockdown. Based in the Department of Hospitality and Tourism Management, I was one of many wondering what the future held for colleagues in the tourism industry. And naturally, I also wondered and worried about how relevant this left my research. 14 months on, and some initial emerging insights from this first set of interviews includes repeated observations of increased engagement in the beach environment, increased numbers of visitors, and increased litter. There is extensive investment of time, money, and labour, and yet those people responsible for managing our beaches are faced with increasing challenges where visitor behaviours are concerned. Now, my research starts by bringing psychology and design into the mix, the existing tourism and beach environment realm, and keeping the beach user at the very heart of it. And this is from initial scoping right through to the design of a behaviour change intervention. We are undoubtedly faced with a rapidly changing landscape where sustainable tourism is concerned. And to address the rapidly evolving challenges, I believe we would benefit from greater insight into the human behaviours at play and from better understanding of user needs so that we can meet them. I'm starting by accepting, as I said, that behaving in a pro-environmental way doesn't always happen due to traditionally green attitudes or intentions, that the same person who recycles may sometimes leave cigarette butts in drains, that litter bins can have a perverse effect on littering. I've started by seeking understanding of what the beach brings to its users, the value that they derive from it, and working to identify what drives decision-making, whether that be in policy design, beach management operations, conservation, local community. And next, I'm conducting observation of user behaviour on the beaches, followed by interviews with those recreational beach users. And finally, a sample of these users will participate in the co-design and the testing of this behaviour change intervention. And that's informed by all of this. Now, my study aims not simply to prototype a behaviour change intervention, but to prototype a methodology for approaching sustainable tourism challenges. By taking an iterative approach, it allows for learning to be applied and for the direction to be revised with this learning. And it starts from the assumption that better understanding through better engagement with our tourists in general, and in this case, beach users, professional and recreational in particular, leads to better outcomes. There are two certainties here. The first is that we are facing unprecedented change. And the second, a constant, is that at the heart of tourism now and always are people. I believe that we design for change better when we work alongside these people, when we learn from them and we share the tackling of these challenges with those humans whose behaviour we're focusing on. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Rachel, and good luck with your PhD. And we look forward to reading the outcomes of your results. So it's clear that for you, consumers are in the heart of the changes that we could expect in the future. So now we'll be taking the questions from the floor. I do have, I did receive a couple of questions before we started this webinar. The first one is from a consultant in sustainability in tourism in Europe. And his first question is the following. Do you see a relation between the awareness of a carbon footprint of a traveler and his or her social economic behavior in the destination? So this is the first question. I repeat, do you see a relation between the awareness of a carbon footprint of a traveler and his or her social economic behavior in the destination?
I could have a go at responding to that, Monda. We hear a lot about the more conscious traveller and and those who deeply care about sustainability. But if you look at some of the existing schemes, for example, offsetting your own travel on a plane, most of those voluntary schemes run by airlines have at best about 7 or 8% of passengers ticking the box to offset their travel. So while it's an opt-in currently, and there's no one, I don't think, is yet operating an opt-out carbon offsetting scheme, it is still only some travellers who have this sustainability awareness, but certainly those travellers are seen as desirable by a market like New Zealand, and their behaviour once they get here, they are likely to be wanting an authentic experience. They may well expect the services and products they use to be delivered in a sustainable way. So it is a market segment. It's still a small market segment. Sometimes you would get the impression that it's now the dominant approach of the visitor. I'm sure it will grow further, but it's still just a relatively small part of the overall market.
Thank you, Chris.
Can I?
Yes, please, Jim.
Yeah, just briefly a comment. Really, I think the whole carbon footprint discussion is very, very interesting one. One thing that it does is it presents the issue of carbon emissions at the level of consumption to an individual. So the individual's supposed to act and reduce their carbon footprint, and that's going to solve the problem. I think there's some problems with individualizing such an important issue as reducing carbon emissions in that way. First of all, you have to question whether it is really ethical, because as consumers, it's very difficult to be ethical. You don't travel to save the environment, but by virtue of not traveling, somebody doesn't get paid. You know, you can't win. You can't have it both ways. This is a problem that will be and is being addressed and solved, not quickly enough, through technology. I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that within a few generations that we'll be able to, with the right kind of investment in technology and commitment, of course, that we will be looking at the prospect of carbon, relatively speaking, carbon-free flying. All of these things are being developed. The prototypes are there. In the spirit of what I was saying earlier in my talk, we tend to live in the present, and of course, carbon emissions are a massive problem in the present. But whether they can be resolved simply by looking at the current level of technology and encouraging consumers not to travel, and that damages economies, I think a much better bet is to really encourage, the innovation and progressively decouple growth from carbon emissions. And I think one of the very exciting things is for our students and for ourselves in our lifetimes, this is something that we can, we should be able to look forward to.
Thanks, Jim. The second question is from Thailand, and someone is asking, how can tourism providers reconcile the need for tourists to return to Thailand without conflicting with the significant majority of local people who are much fearful for COVID-19?
For us here in the tourism industry in New Zealand, we've made it very clear that the safety of the local population is the number one priority. And those decisions need to be made by the health experts guiding the government. And so borders should not open if there is risk, significant risk to the local population. And governments then need to work with their communities to give them the reassurance that when they take those decisions to open borders, that they've assessed all the risks and they're managing the risks. The last thing tourism wants is to be blamed for risking the health of the local population. So I'm sure that situation would also apply in Thailand and anywhere else. and tourism industries are very, I'm also sure, are very careful to be seen not to be putting the dollar ahead of the health of their communities. So we've always been very clear, the decisions on when New Zealand opens up to other countries is for the government to take, guided by health advice and taking a risk-based approach and keeping the risk as low as practical. And if that's done, then when the borders do open, then the community should be, on the whole, supportive and welcoming of those visitors coming back.
Thank you, Chris. Any other comments?
I would add,
Yes.
Yeah, I would
Yes,
add
Rachel.
to that. I also work within the Northern Ireland government, and that role involves some of the COVID transmission behaviour advice. I'm a behavioural scientist there, and I think that what has come across is the importance of very clear messaging that people receive and a great degree of consistency. And in order for that sense of safety and a degree of predictability when it comes to what measures need to be undertaken in order to protect yourself, and knowing in advance how that's likely to impact as somebody going into another country or another jurisdiction, being able to almost work through that process in advance can lead to greater confidence. And I appreciate, I think the question was from the other side of things, tourists coming into the country, but it's just something that's also relevant for tourists to travel elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. So the third question is from New Zealand. What are the dangers of degrowth from the perspective of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN? So, what are the dangers of degrowth from the SDG perspective? Yes, Jim. We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. The dangers of degrowth from the perspective of the SDGs, well, in general, let me just briefly address it in terms of the dangers of degrowth, in terms of development. I think that there are different things here, and I understand when Rachel's talking about degrowth, she's talking about policies and things that, at the level of the beach or the locality. I was generally referring to degrowth as a development philosophy, which is very popular amongst geographers and tourism geographers and other academics. And the argument of degrowth as a development philosophy is that the world should literally degrow, that the world is too global, that economies should shrink, become more localized, reliant on local resources. And that would include things like, people being more rooted in terms of tourism. And I think that degrowth is absolutely disastrous for the Sustainable Development Goals. It takes economies backwards. It flies in the face of economic principles like the division of labour, comparative advantage, and so on. And it has been rightly described by commentators like Lee Phillips and Branko Milanovic, ex-World Bank economist, as eco-austerity. And I really can't stress enough how much I am against the current fashion for talking up degrowth in tourism. Absolutely, individual policies at a local level can make a great deal of sense. Small-scale tourism, ecotourism, they can make sense in this time, in this place, and so on. But as a development philosophy, it has, this is a debate in development economics and so on. But in my opinion, it would be devastating. And just bear in mind, we're just coming out, hopefully, of COVID-19. I actually don't think we fully comprehend the horror of that. In our own societies, it's been bad enough, but I think the effect, in certain parts of poorer parts of the world, economically poorer parts of the world, are absolutely terrifying. And of course, many of those societies don't have the economic capacity to furlough workers, that kind of thing. A lot of hospitality employment is in the informal economy. There's been nothing to fall back on. So I want growth, absolutely growth. I don't want growth at all costs, and I don't want unplanned growth. And just to link to one of the other questions, I think that was on the web here, I think the really key thing about growth is to try and bring it more closely under democratic control. And you see the demands for that in cities like Barcelona and Amsterdam. But there are very few people, I can tell you, in the developing world favouring degrowth, for kind of obvious reasons. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Chris, would you like to make comment from New Zealand's perspective about this topic?
No, I think Jim covered that quite well, but
okay.
So I'm happy to leap on to one of the next questions.
Yes, yes. So this is the question. Can you see the question?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, perfect. So yeah. So Chris, maybe you.
Yeah, there's a question there about capitalism being a driver of tourism development, but focusing in the past mostly on the economic benefits of the visitor rather than the well-being of the community. I do agree with that, and we need to have a better balance. One thing we're in discussions here currently with Tourism New Zealand, the government's marketing agency, is around defining what we mean by a high-value visitor. And as I said earlier, every country wants to attract high-value visitors, but very few are able to define what they mean by that. And in the past, it's generally been about someone who spends a lot of money. I think what we're really talking about, or we need to talk about, is a high-quality visitor. And that's not just about the money they spend. It's about the attitude they bring with them to the place they're visiting. It's about the time of year they travel. It's about where they travel. It's about the type of activities they undertake. It may well be about their own carbon footprint. What impact do they have on climate change in getting to that destination? How do they travel once they're there? So we're starting some work on a far broader definition of what this desirable traveller looks like. What is this high value or high quality visitor? And it has to go well beyond the previous definitions of a visitor who spends a lot of money.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Chris. Chris, there is another question with regard to New Zealand. I don't know whether you can see the question here. Can you see the
one about our control over visitor arrivals?
Yes.
So obviously where we sit on the planet, we do have more control over visitor arrivals than some other countries, and that's one factor why New Zealand's been so successful in managing COVID. Could we use, the question asked, could we use tourist visas to shape the return of international tourism? My belief is not really, unless we took some radical steps and damaged our international relationships to a serious degree. We have long-standing arrangements that allow 60-plus countries to come here without a visa. And so we have no control over who comes from those countries. And then from the other countries that do require visas, there's some fairly standard requirements that they have to show, essentially to show that they can support themselves and they will return to their country of origin after they've been here as a visitor. You could attempt to use the border to control who comes by requiring a visa from everyone and requiring some sort of evidence that they will, again, come back into the spend, will spend lots of money while they're here. But I think the potential risk to country relationships would be massive if we started trying to impose those conditions on other countries, and the potential for reciprocal actions by those countries. And we've seen that before. A few years ago, New Zealand decided to require South Africans to get a visa before coming to New Zealand, and previously they did not require a visa. South Africa responded within days and required visas from New Zealanders going the other way. So you have to be very careful about international reactions if you try to use the border as the tool to manage the types of visitors that you're attracting.
You're on silent, Mondo.
Apologies. I said, Jim, this might be a question for you. Can you see the question? We can't hear you.
Sorry, I can see a lot of questions. Did you have one in mind?
Yeah. How can we encourage sustainability within the ecotourism destination when economies in developing countries are struggling economically from the impact of COVID-19? Yeah,
okay. I know the person asking this question. Okay, it's an interesting question. I mean, I guess what lies behind the question is the idea that because of COVID-19, rural communities will be really desperate for economic development and therefore may not pay so much attention to the form of that economic development and ensuring that it's sustainable and so on. I don't have a clear answer to that necessarily. I mean, I think one of the things about ecotourism is in rural areas is that it can be a very good, innovative way of bringing a degree of wealth, not a great deal of wealth, but a degree of wealth to rural communities and benefiting the economy in that way and so on. But I don't agree that ecotourism should have the sort of fated status as a sustainable form of tourism that it has. You know, there is this kind of idea that ecotourism is almost regarded as a development philosophy for rural development because it does bring together conservation and development sort of symbiotically and therefore is regarded as sustainable development. The problem with ecotourism is that as a development philosophy, it kind of says to communities, you can bring tourists and you can have a degree of wealth based on that, but then it stops. You know, then the development is limited because of the notion that you know, the environment should not be changed, and therefore you know, it kind of promises development, also kind of puts a sort of conceptual cap on how far that can go. So I guess my answer, Tia, is I wish the communities good luck in trying to leverage economic development in the form of ecotourism, but also well beyond that, because as you know yourself, rural Thailand in the north especially would benefit economically a great deal from better transport links, you know, from infrastructure, in order to develop tourism and other industries as well. And you know, localized ecotourism projects are one thing, but infrastructure that links the local to the national and the international, I think, are actually more important as a form of development. So I look forward to those developments, as well as, not instead of, the important ecotourism projects that I know that you're very passionate about.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. I think we reached, it's 10:15, and we mentioned that we will finish at 10:15. I'm sorry if I wasn't able to cover all the questions. So on behalf of the tourism group, I would like to thank you for your contributions to this seminar, especially for people who are currently in Europe. So it's a bit late for you. It's 11:15, I think. No, 11:15 p.m. your time, I think. So thank you for being with us. Thanks, Chris, for your contribution from a New Zealand perspective. So on behalf of the tourism group, I would like to thank you for this contribution. And just would like to advise the participants that we have a webinar. No, it would be, no, sorry, a seminar and not webinar that will be organized on the 29th of June at Victoria University from 1 to 2 p.m. And the speaker is one of our former PhD student, Heike, who will be joining us from from Auckland University, AUT in Auckland. So thank you again for Jim, for Rachel, and Chris for your contributions, and thanks Abby for organizing this webinar for us. So have a lovely day, Chris. Have a good evening, Jim and Rachel, and hopefully we will see you as participants to our webinars or seminars next time. Thank you. Have a lovely day or evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, everybody, for showing up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.